The officers had received several wireless warnings throughout the day. Ships crossing the North Atlantic had reported heavy ice fields, drifting pack ice, and large icebergs directly along Titanic's planned route. Each message was passed to the bridge, but none of them suggested immediate danger. Ice in April was common, and experienced captains had crossed these waters many times before. Captain Edward Smith adjusted the ship's course slightly farther south earlier in the voyage, yet Titanic continued steaming at nearly full speed. Confident in the ship's strength and eager to arrive in New York on schedule, there seemed to be little reason for concern. As darkness settled over the Atlantic, the temperature continued to fall. The sea became strangely calm. There were no waves breaking against the hidden ice, making floating icebergs almost impossible to detect. Above, the sky remained perfectly clear, filled with thousands of stars. It was a beautiful night, but one that offered very little contrast between the black ocean and the horizon. High above the deck, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood inside the crow's nest. Their task was simple but critical. Watch the darkness ahead for anything that could threaten the ship. The lookout station had no binoculars. They relied only on their eyesight, scanning the endless black water as the freezing wind swept across the bow. Minute after minute, nothing disturbed the silence except the steady vibration of Titanic's engines. Deep below them, passengers filled the grand dining rooms, elegant lounges, and smoking rooms. First-class travelers enjoyed coffee, cigars, and conversation beneath glittering chandeliers. Musicians performed softly, while guests laughed and discussed their plans for America. In second class, families relaxed after dinner, reading books or preparing for bed. In third class, immigrants gathered together, singing songs, sharing stories, and dreaming about the new lives waiting across the ocean. Few people thought about the freezing sea surrounding them. To nearly everyone aboard, Titanic felt invincible. The massive liner had performed flawlessly since leaving Southampton. Every engine, boiler, and electrical system operated exactly as designed. Crew members carried out their routines with quiet confidence, and passengers admired the comfort and stability of the world's newest luxury ship. Shortly before midnight, wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride remained busy inside the Marconi room. They were sending passengers personal messages to stations on land. The backlog of telegrams had grown after the wireless equipment temporarily failed earlier in the voyage. Every minute mattered as they worked to clear the queue before Titanic moved beyond transmission range. Around 10:55 p.m., another nearby ship, the Californian, transmitted a warning. It had stopped completely after becoming surrounded by heavy ice. The operator attempted to inform Titanic that dangerous ice lay directly ahead. Phillips, focused on sending commercial messages, answered sharply that he was busy communicating with Cape Race. After that brief exchange, the Californian's wireless operator shut down his equipment for the night. It would be the last conversation between the two ships before disaster struck. On the bridge, Murdoch continued watching the darkness. Quartermaster Robert Hickens held the wheel steady while the officers monitored the compass and the sea ahead. Everything appeared calm. The great liner cut smoothly through the cold Atlantic at more than 22 knots. Time passed quietly. Then, at 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet suddenly noticed something unusual directly ahead. At first, it looked like a faint shadow rising from the darkness. Within seconds, the shape became clearer. A massive iceberg stood directly in Titanic's path. Fleet rang the warning bell in the crow's nest 3 times and immediately picked up the telephone connecting him to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead," he shouted. "Iceberg, right ahead." Fleet's warning reached the bridge in an instant. First Officer William Murdoch reacted without hesitation. "Hard a starboard," he ordered, directing Quartermaster Robert Hichens to turn the ship as sharply as possible. At the same time, Murdoch signaled the engine room to stop the engines, and then ordered full astern in a desperate attempt to reduce the impact. Massive machinery deep inside the ship responded within seconds. But a vessel the size of Titanic could not change direction instantly. Weighing more than 46,000 tons and traveling at over 22 knots, she continued moving relentlessly toward the dark shape ahead. The bow slowly began to swing to port. For a brief moment, it seemed the ship might clear the iceberg after all. Then, at 11:40 p.m., the starboard side brushed against the ice. The collision was surprisingly gentle. There was no violent crash, no deafening explosion, only a long scraping vibration that echoed through the hull as towering walls of ice slid silently past the windows. Small pieces of ice broke free and scattered across the forward well deck, where several crew members looked around in confusion. Many passengers barely noticed anything unusual. Some felt only a slight shudder beneath their feet. Others paused for a moment before continuing their conversations, card games, or preparations for bed. A few curious passengers stepped outside to see what had happened, smiling as they kicked fragments of ice lying on the deck like fresh snow. Deep below the waterline, however, the damage was catastrophic. The iceberg's uneven underwater edge had sliced open the starboard side of the hull. One by one, the forward watertight compartments began filling with freezing Atlantic water. The flooding spread faster than anyone on board could see. In the boiler rooms, engineers and firemen heard the terrifying roar of seawater rushing through the steel plates. Within seconds, icy water surged around their feet. Some men escaped by climbing through heavy watertight doors just before they slammed shut. Others remained behind, continuing to keep the lights and pumps operating despite knowing the danger was growing by the minute. On the bridge, Murdoch immediately ordered the watertight doors closed. Powerful electric mechanisms forced the giant steel doors downward, sealing off the damaged compartments. It was exactly the kind of emergency the ship had been designed to survive. Yet no one knew how serious the damage truly was. Captain Edward Smith, who had been resting in his cabin, arrived on the bridge only moments later. Calm but visibly concerned, he asked a simple question. "What have we struck?" Murdoch explained the encounter with the iceberg and the actions he had taken. Captain Smith ordered a full inspection below deck without delay. Shipbuilder Thomas Andrews was summoned from his cabin to examine the damage himself. As Titanic's designer, no one understood the ship better than Andrews. Together with Captain Smith and several officers, he descended into the lower decks. What they found was far worse than anyone had imagined. Water was already pouring into multiple forward compartments. Engineers reported that at least 5 compartments had been breached. Andrews quietly performed the calculations in his head. Titanic had been built to remain afloat with 4 flooded compartments. 5 meant there was no possibility of saving the ship. He looked at Captain Smith and delivered the conclusion no one wanted to hear. "She is going to sink." For a few silent moments, Captain Smith said nothing. He understood exactly what Andrews meant. The flooding could not be stopped, and every passing minute would allow more seawater to spill over the tops of the forward compartments into the next ones. It was only a matter of time. Andrews estimated that Titanic had little more than 2 hours before she would disappear beneath the Atlantic. The captain immediately returned to the bridge and began issuing orders. "Prepare the lifeboats. Wake the passengers. Tell them to put on their life belts." Crew members hurried through the corridors, knocking on cabin doors. Most passengers were confused rather than frightened. Many believed the stop was only a precaution. The ship still felt steady beneath their feet. The electric lights were still glowing, and there was no sign of panic. In first class, stewards politely informed guests that they should dress warmly and come up on deck. Some passengers laughed, asking if the midnight interruption was really necessary. Others wrapped themselves in heavy coats and fur jackets before making their way upstairs. In second and third class, families gathered their children, unsure whether to carry luggage or leave everything behind. Few realized they would never see their cabins again. Meanwhile, distress messages began leaving Titanic's wireless room. Jack Phillips tapped rapidly across the key, while Harold Bride assisted beside him. At first, they transmitted the familiar distress signal, CQD, followed by Titanic's position. Soon they also began using the newer international signal, SOS, one of the first times it had ever been sent during a real maritime disaster. Across the North Atlantic, wireless operators aboard nearby ships suddenly heard the urgent calls. Some answered immediately, promising to change course and steam toward Titanic as fast as possible. Among them was the Cunard liner Carpathia. More than 50 miles away, Captain Arthur Rostron was awakened and informed that Titanic was in serious trouble. Without hesitation, he ordered his ship to turn toward the reported position at full speed. Engineers pushed Carpathia's engines beyond their normal operating limits, while crew members prepared blankets, food, hot drinks, and every available berth for survivors. Back aboard Titanic, the first lifeboats were uncovered and swung outward over the decks. Although the ship carried more than enough boats to satisfy the safety regulations of the time, there were only 20 lifeboats in total, far too few for the more than 2,200 people on board. Many passengers noticed the small number but still refused to believe the situation was life-threatening. Some even hesitated to leave the warmth of the ship for a small wooden boat hanging above the freezing black ocean. Captain Smith repeated the order that would define the evacuation. Women and children first. The officers interpreted those words differently. On the starboard side, Murdoch allowed women and children to board first, but filled empty seats with nearby men when few women stepped forward. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller enforced the rule much more strictly, allowing almost no adult men into the boats, while women or children remained nearby. As a result, several early lifeboats were lowered only partially full, leaving dozens of empty seats that could never be recovered. As the first lifeboats disappeared into the darkness, many passengers still believed they would soon return to the ship. Some even joked with friends standing on deck, promising to meet again for breakfast in New York. The crew struggled to convince people that leaving the warmth and safety of the great liner was the only chance of survival. Because the danger was not yet visible, hesitation became one of their greatest obstacles. Inside the ship, however, the situation was changing rapidly. The bow continued to settle lower into the freezing Atlantic as thousands of tons of water poured through the damaged compartments. Engineers, electricians, and firemen remained at their posts, keeping the boilers, pumps, and generators running for as long as possible. Their work kept the lights burning, allowing the evacuation to continue in relative order. Despite the growing crisis, Thomas Andrews moved quickly through the decks, urging passengers to put on life belts and board the boats without delay. Those who recognized him later remembered the urgency in his voice. He understood that every minute wasted meant fewer lives could be saved. Yet many people simply could not believe that a ship as large and modern as Titanic was actually sinking. On the boat deck, the orchestra gathered under the direction of Wallace Hartley. Rather than abandoning their instruments, the musicians began playing calm, familiar melodies to steady the crowd. Their music drifted across the cold night air, offering a sense of normality in the middle of an unfolding disaster. Survivors would later remember the sound of the band long after they had forgotten many other details of that night. Below deck, stewards guided passengers through narrow passageways toward the staircases leading to the boat deck. Some families became separated in the confusion. Husbands kissed their wives goodbye, believing they would follow in the next boat. Parents lifted frightened children into lifeboats while trying to hide their own fear. Crew members worked tirelessly to keep people moving, even as the ship's list became more noticeable. Distress rockets burst high above the ship, filling the sky with brilliant white light before fading into the darkness. Each rocket was a desperate signal asking for immediate help. In the distance, the crew of the California noticed the flares, but failed to understand their meaning. With its wireless operator off duty for the night, the nearby ship remained motionless, unaware that one of the greatest maritime disasters in history was unfolding only a short distance away. Time was running out. More lifeboats were lowered, but every launch became more difficult as the deck tilted farther toward the sea. The freezing water had already reached additional compartments, and the bow continued its slow but unstoppable descent. Captain Smith walked quietly across the boat deck, encouraging the crew to keep loading passengers as quickly as possible. He knew rescue ships were still too far away. Titanic would have to survive on her own for just a little longer, but every calculation suggested that time was almost gone. By 1:45 a.m., the angle of the deck had become impossible to ignore. Passengers who had once doubted the danger now hurried toward the remaining lifeboats. The calm, orderly evacuation slowly gave way to urgency, as people realized there were not enough seats for everyone. Crew members fought to keep the lines organized, preventing panic from spreading across the crowded boat deck. Lifeboat after lifeboat descended into the freezing darkness, each carrying men, women, and children away from the ship's glowing lights. Those already in the boats looked back in disbelief. From a distance, Titanic still appeared magnificent, her rows of illuminated windows reflecting across the calm Atlantic as though nothing were wrong. Only the steadily lowering bow revealed the truth. On board, many acts of courage unfolded in silence. Crew members helped complete strangers into the boats before stepping back onto the deck themselves. Engineers remained below, keeping electricity flowing despite the rapidly rising water. Their sacrifice allowed the lights to stay on almost until the very end, giving hundreds of people precious extra minutes to escape. Captain Smith continued moving across the ship, checking the evacuation and urging the officers to launch every remaining lifeboat. Thomas Andrews refused every opportunity to save himself, choosing instead to assist passengers until there was nothing more he could do. His dream ship, the masterpiece he had spent years helping create, was disappearing before his eyes. The orchestra continued to play as the temperature dropped even further. The music mixed with the sound of escaping steam, the creaking of steel, and the distant voices of frightened passengers. Some people prayed quietly. Others stood together in silence, accepting that there would not be enough boats. Below deck, seawater surged through corridors that had once been filled with laughter and conversation. Furniture broke loose, doors burst open under the pressure, and the forward grand staircase slowly began filling with icy water. The luxurious rooms that had amazed passengers only days earlier were now being reclaimed by the Atlantic. Shortly after 2 a.m., only a handful of collapsible lifeboats remained. Officers and crew worked frantically to free them from the roof of the officers' quarters, while the deck continued to tilt beneath their feet. Every minute became more difficult than the last. Passengers climbed higher toward the stern as the bow sank deeper into the sea. Titanic's enormous propellers slowly lifted clear of the water, revealing their massive bronze blades for the first time. Those watching from the lifeboats could hardly believe the sight. The largest passenger ship ever built was rising into the night sky, her stern towering above the dark ocean. Even then, her lights continued to burn, a haunting reminder that thousands of people were still trapped aboard as the final moments drew near. Just after 2:15 a.m., the lights flickered for the first time. For a brief moment they grew dim, then returned, powered by the engineers who continued fighting to keep the generators alive below deck. It was their final gift to those still searching for a way off the ship. Minutes later, the lights failed again. This time they went out forever. Titanic, once the brightest object on the Atlantic, disappeared into complete darkness beneath a sky filled with stars. Only the sounds remained. The roar of steam escaping from the funnels echoed across the ocean. Steel groaned under tremendous pressure as the ship's structure reached its limit. People in the lifeboats watched in stunned silence, unable to look away. The bow sank deeper until the stern rose almost vertically above the water. Thousands of passengers and crew clung to the decks, railings, and every object they could reach as gravity pulled them toward the sea. Then, with a deafening crack, the enormous hull broke apart between the third and fourth funnels. The force of the breakup threw people and debris into the freezing Atlantic. The forward section, already filled with water, plunged rapidly beneath the surface and disappeared into the darkness. For a brief moment, the stern settled back toward the water before rising once again. Now completely separated, the aft section drifted almost upright. Water rushed through its open interior as it slowly lost the last of its buoyancy. Those watching from the lifeboats later described an unforgettable silence that lasted only seconds before the stern began its final descent. At approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the stern slipped beneath the surface and vanished into the North Atlantic. Titanic was gone. In an instant, the calm ocean became filled with hundreds of people struggling in water colder than -2 degrees Celsius. The shock was overwhelming. Many lost the ability to breathe within seconds as the freezing water stole the heat from their bodies. Others fought desperately to stay afloat by clinging to floating wreckage. Their cries for help spread across the still night, reaching every lifeboat scattered around the sinking site. Survivors would later say that this was the most heartbreaking moment of the disaster. The voices rose together into a single desperate chorus that echoed across the empty Atlantic. Yet the lifeboats carried far more people than they were designed to rescue from the water. Many feared that returning would cause their boats to be swamped by panicked survivors. One by one, the cries grew weaker. Within less than half an hour, the freezing sea had fallen almost completely silent. An endless darkness settled over the Atlantic. The survivors drifted in small wooden lifeboats, surrounded by floating debris and an ocean that had claimed more than 1,500 lives. Wrapped in blankets or thin coats, many sat in complete silence, too shocked to speak. Others searched the horizon, hoping to see the lights of a rescue ship. The temperature continued to fall as the lifeboats rose and fell gently on the calm sea. Every passing minute felt like an hour. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, realizing that the cries for help had nearly stopped, gathered several lifeboats together and transferred passengers so that one boat would have enough room to return to the wreck site. By the time Lowe finally rowed back, only a handful of people were still alive in the freezing water. He managed to rescue a small number of survivors, but for almost everyone else, the Atlantic had already taken its toll. Hours passed in darkness. Then, shortly after 4 a.m., a faint glow appeared on the horizon. At first, it looked like another star, but the light slowly grew larger. It was the Carpathia. Captain Arthur Rostron had driven his ship through dangerous ice at full speed after receiving Titanic's distress calls, ordering extra lookouts and preparing every available space for survivors. As Carpathia approached, rockets were fired to guide the lifeboats toward the ship. One by one, the exhausted survivors were lifted aboard. Crew members handed out blankets, dry clothing, hot drinks, and medical care. Many passengers collapsed from exhaustion the moment they reached the deck. Others stood silently, staring back toward the empty ocean where Titanic had disappeared only hours before. Families searched desperately for loved ones, reading names aloud and moving from lifeboat to lifeboat in hope of finding familiar faces. For countless people, that reunion never came. When the final lifeboat had been recovered, Carpathia's crew counted the survivors. Around 705 people had been saved. More than 1,500 passengers and crew had lost their lives, making the sinking of Titanic one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Captain Rostron ordered Carpathia to set course for New York. The voyage was painfully quiet. The joy of survival was overshadowed by grief, uncertainty, and the realization that so many had been left behind. Newspapers around the world soon carried the shocking news, and millions struggled to believe that the largest and most celebrated passenger ship ever built had vanished on her maiden voyage. As investigations began in both the United States and Britain, important lessons emerged from the tragedy. New international safety rules required enough lifeboats for every person on board, continuous wireless operation, and regular lifeboat drills. Ice patrols were established to monitor dangerous waters in the North Atlantic, helping protect future generations of ships from a similar fate. More than a century has passed since that cold April night, yet the story of Titanic continues to captivate people around the world. It is remembered not only for the scale of the disaster, but for the courage, sacrifice, and humanity shown during its final hours. The ship may have disappeared beneath the Atlantic, but the lessons it left behind have never been forgotten. As Carpathia continued toward New York, the reality of what had happened slowly began to settle over everyone on board. The survivors had escaped the freezing Atlantic, but they had left behind family members, friends, and fellow passengers, whose names would never again be answered. Throughout the ship, crew members worked tirelessly to care for the exhausted men, women, and children. Dry clothes were distributed, hot soup and coffee were served, and doctors treated those suffering from hypothermia, shock, and injuries sustained during the evacuation. Cabins were offered to women and children, while many of Carpathia's own passengers willingly gave up their beds to strangers who had lost everything. Despite these acts of kindness, silence filled much of the ship. Every conversation eventually returned to the same question: who had survived and who had not? Lists of names were written and rewritten as survivors searched desperately for loved ones. Some families experienced moments of overwhelming joy after finding each other aboard Carpathia. Others waited hour after hour, refusing to believe that a missing husband, wife, parent, or child would never appear. Harold Bride, the assistant wireless operator, despite suffering severe injuries to his feet during the sinking, returned to work almost immediately. Alongside Carpathia's wireless operators, he helped send messages to shore confirming that Titanic had been lost. Newspapers across Europe and the United States had already begun reporting conflicting information. Some early reports incorrectly claimed the Titanic was being towed safely to port, with everyone rescued. As accurate messages finally reached land, those hopeful stories quickly disappeared. The world learned that the largest passenger ship ever built had sunk on her maiden voyage with enormous loss of life. Crowds gathered outside newspaper offices, shipping company headquarters, and telegraph stations, desperate for information. Families waited for official survivor lists to be posted, scanning every line in search of familiar names. For many, those lists brought relief. For thousands of others, they brought unbearable grief. When Carpathia entered New York Harbor on the evening of April 18, 1912, heavy rain covered the city. thousands of people stood along the waterfront despite the weather, watching silently as the rescue ship approached. Journalists filled the docks, photographers prepared their cameras, and relatives searched every face visible on deck. As survivors stepped onto land, many were too exhausted to speak. Some covered their faces to avoid the waiting reporters. Others embraced relatives they had believed they would never see again. Behind every joyful reunion stood countless families whose loved ones would never return. Within days, formal investigations began. Both the United States Senate and the British Board of Trade questioned survivors, officers, wireless operators, and maritime experts in an effort to understand exactly how such a disaster had occurred. Testimony continued for weeks, revealing critical mistakes, unexpected circumstances, and weaknesses in existing safety regulations. Investigators concluded that Titanic had received multiple iceberg warnings before the collision, yet continued at nearly full speed through dangerous waters. They also confirmed that the ship carried lifeboats for only a fraction of the people on board, even though it technically met the outdated legal requirements of the time. Perhaps most importantly, the disaster demonstrated the need for continuous wireless communication aboard passenger ships. If every nearby vessel had maintained a radio operator throughout the night, more lives might have been saved. The tragedy transformed international maritime safety. New regulations required enough lifeboats for every passenger and crew member, mandatory emergency drills, continuous wireless watches, and improved evacuation procedures. In 1914, nations established the International Ice Patrol, a service that continues to monitor iceberg movements across the North Atlantic to this day. These changes became part of Titanic's lasting legacy, ensuring that the lessons paid for with so many lives would protect future generations of travelers. More than 100 years later, the story of Titanic remains one of history's most powerful reminders that even the greatest achievements of human engineering are never beyond the forces of nature. It is remembered not only because a magnificent ship was lost, but because ordinary people displayed extraordinary courage in its final hours. Officers remained at their posts. Engineers sacrificed their lives to keep the lights burning. Musicians continued playing to calm frightened passengers. And countless individuals chose to help others instead of saving themselves. Their actions turned a terrible disaster into a story that has continued to inspire respect, reflection, and remembrance across generations. For decades, the memory of Titanic refused to fade. Survivors carried the events of that night with them for the rest of their lives. Many rarely spoke about what they had witnessed, while others dedicated themselves to ensuring that the victims would never be forgotten. Every anniversary brought renewed interest, and newspapers continued to publish interviews with those who had escaped. Their memories often differed in small details, yet they all described the same overwhelming emotions: disbelief, fear, courage, and unimaginable loss. As technology advanced, new generations of explorers became determined to find the ship resting on the ocean floor. The North Atlantic, however, guarded its secret well. Titanic had disappeared into one of the deepest and most hostile environments on Earth. Violent storms, freezing temperatures, and immense water pressure made the search extraordinarily difficult. For more than 70 years, countless expeditions attempted to locate the wreck without success. Then, in September 1985, an international expedition led by oceanographer Robert Ballard finally discovered Titanic nearly 4,000 meters beneath the surface. Instead of finding the ship in one piece, the team revealed that the bow and stern lay separated by a vast field of debris scattered across the seabed. Personal belongings, furniture, dishes, shoes, and countless other objects remained where they had fallen during the final moments of the sinking. The discovery confirmed many details described by survivors, while also answering questions that had remained unresolved for generations. Images of the wreck shocked the world. The once magnificent Grand Liner now rested in complete darkness, covered with rust and strange marine life. Broken railings, collapsed decks, and silent corridors stood as reminders of the disaster that had unfolded more than 7 decades earlier. Scientists emphasized that the site should be treated as a maritime grave, a place where more than 1,500 people had lost their lives. Over the years, advances in underwater technology allowed researchers to study the wreck in remarkable detail without disturbing it unnecessarily. High-resolution cameras, remotely operated vehicles, and detailed 3-dimensional mapping provided an increasingly accurate picture of Titanic's final resting place. These expeditions deepened historians' understanding of the sinking, while helping preserve the ship's story for future generations. Nature, however, continues its slow work. Specialized bacteria consume the iron that once formed Titanic's hull, gradually weakening the remaining structure. Experts believe that one day much of the wreck may collapse completely, leaving only scattered pieces across the ocean floor. For that reason, every new survey serves not only as scientific research, but also as an effort to document one of history's most significant archaeological sites. Before time erases it forever, Titanic has inspired countless books, documentaries, museums, and films, introducing millions of people to the events of April 1912. Yet beyond the famous images and dramatic retellings lies a far more meaningful story. It is the story of ordinary passengers chasing new opportunities, dedicated crew members performing their duties until the very end, and rescuers who risked everything to save complete strangers. More than a century later, the names of the victims are still read at memorial ceremonies around the world. Fresh flowers are placed beside monuments. Church bells ring in remembrance, and descendants continue sharing the stories of relatives whose lives were forever connected to that single voyage. Titanic's legacy is no longer defined simply by the ship itself. It lives on through the lessons it taught, the safety standards it inspired, and the courage displayed during its final hours. History remembers the disaster because of the lives that were changed, the mistakes that were corrected, and the humanity that emerged in the face of overwhelming tragedy. Even today, whenever the name Titanic is spoken, it represents far more than steel, engines, or luxury. It stands as a timeless reminder that determination, compassion, and sacrifice can shine brightest in humanity's darkest moments, ensuring that the people of Titanic will never truly be forgotten.